The fires burned high that day. In every corner of France, Templar knights were dragged from their beds. Heretics, they called them traitors, idol worshippers, enemies of God. But something doesn't sit right. The charges were too strange, too theatrical. A bearded head, a kiss on the spine, a demon named Baphomet. Either the church invented a heresy to destroy the Templars, or the Templars were hiding something even darker. Whatever the truth is, it didn't die in the flames. It's still here beneath the ashes, waiting. But let's slow down. The panic has passed. The smoke has cleared. What's left behind are whispers buried in vaults folded into parchment, etched faintly in the corners of forgotten cathedrals. If you're quiet enough and patient enough, the echoes begin to return. That's where we're going now, into the quiet. This isn't the Paris, you know. There are no cafes, no lantern-lit bridges, just mud streets, smoky air, and cold stone cloisters where power walks in velvet slippers. It's the autumn of 1307. The sky is lean. Somewhere in the city, a bell tolls, not to mark the hour, but to signal the beginning of something coordinated, chillingly so. Across France, the same thing is happening. One order, one date, one silent sweep. The Knights Templar had stood for nearly 2 centuries. Holy warriors, monks with swords. They protected pilgrims. They fought in the Crusades. They built castles stronger than kings. And quietly, they built something even greater, an international financial network. Deposits, loans, safe storage. Europe's most secure vaults didn't belong to monarchs. They belonged to the temple, and that made them dangerous. By the early 1300s, King Philip IVTH of France, brilliant, ambitious, and terminally broke, was desperate. He'd taxed his people to the bone. He'd fought endless wars. He'd even expelled the Jews and seized their assets. The Templars were the last piggy bank left. And worse, they were independent. Their only true allegiance was to the Pope, not to Philip. But Clement V, the Pope at the time, was no innocent. Installed with Philip's influence and living in France, Clement wasn't exactly neutral. Between pressure, persuasion, and likely blackmail, he gave in. And with that, the machinery of suppression began to turn. Templars were accused of unspeakable crimes. Spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, secret initiations, the infamous devil's kiss. It sounded more like the script of a heretical drama than legal accusation. But it worked. Under torture, many confessed, then recanted, then confessed again. The trials dragged on for years. But what if there was more to it than just a frame job? What if some of those stories, however distorted, were rooted in something real? The Templars had secrets. Layers upon layers of them. Symbols carved into chapel walls. Initiation rites passed by word of mouth. And maybe, just maybe, a treasure that no king ever found. This is where the whispers get louder. In cellars beneath castles, in parchments that were lost for centuries, in records that suddenly went missing, in rumors of escape routes and fleets that vanished before the arrests could begin, and in the strange way the Templar myth refuses to die. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because this isn't just the story of a trial. It's the story of how power rewrites the past, and how some stories refuse to stay buried. It began as many betrayals do in silence. No trumpets, no riders thundering down from castles, just sealed orders delivered in secret. Opened at dawn. It was Friday, October 13th, 1307, and across France, as the first light crept across slate rooftops and dew clung to narrow alleyways, a quiet purge was already underway. The Knights Templar, once heroes of Christendom, had no idea they were already condemned. You can almost picture it. A knock at the gate of a preceptor. A sleepy knight pulls open the door. He doesn't even have time to ask a question before the soldiers push past. In dozens of towns and cities, the same pattern played out. At Laon, at Troyes, at Limoges, the order was arrested in a single coordinated stroke. Not just leaders, but initiates, clerks, scribes, cooks, anyone wearing the Red Cross. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was a masterpiece of premeditation. King Philip IV had spent weeks preparing in secret. Every bailiff, every sheriff, every trusted commander had his part. No one knew the full scope until the hour arrived. The Templars were arrested under sealed letters sent across the realm with strict orders not to be opened until the morning of the operation. A chess move with 1,000 pieces, and not a single one out of place. But here's the strange thing. France wasn't at war. There had been no public uprising, no scandalous revelation. One day, the Templars were devout servants of the Church. The next, they were branded heretics, idolaters, enemies of Christ, and perhaps most damning of all holders of suspicious wealth. The official reason for the mass arrest was heresy. The charges were sensational. Denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, worship of a strange head, secret rites that involved indecent gestures and whispered oaths. It sounded less like a legal indictment and more like something pulled from a fevered medieval nightmare. But Philip needed more than just drama. He needed legitimacy, which is why he leaned so hard on Pope Clement V to back the move. And Clement hesitated. Initially, the Pope was caught off guard. Technically, the Templars answered to him, not to any king, but Philip knew what he was doing. Once the accusations were out, public fear began to grow. The Church, already under scrutiny and political pressure, found itself in a corner. And so in the weeks that followed, Clement issued a papal bull authorizing the arrest and trial of Templars not just in France but across Europe. It was no longer a royal vendetta. It had become holy business. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of knights imprisoned, properties seized, vaults opened, inventories taken. In Paris, the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was arrested. Alongside him, the head of Normandy and other high-ranking officials. These weren't renegades. They had dined with the king days before. They had kissed his ring. They had no idea they were about to be unmade. One historical fact that stands unshakably at the center of this moment is the speed and scale of the arrests. Historians agree it was one of the most efficient, widespread, coordinated actions of its kind in medieval Europe, and it caught the Templars completely off guard. But here's the obscure detail, one that still raises eyebrows. In the days following the arrest, some Templar strongholds were already empty, cleared out, documents gone, chests missing. It was as if someone had warned them. Or perhaps someone within the order had read the winds correctly and begun to vanish quietly into the night. And that leads to one of the great open questions that still troubles historians. How many Templars escaped that morning? Was the French crown truly able to sweep them all up? Or were key individuals already in hiding, slipping onto ships, or disappearing into loyal territories where the king's reach could not follow? Because in the aftermath, something strange happened. While French authorities boasted about their efficiency, there were noticeable gaps. Entire inventories listed as missing. Ships that left port with no cargo and didn't return. Rumors swirled of escape, of resistance, even of a secret fleet departing from La Rochelle, the Templars' naval base on the Atlantic coast. Though the historical record offers no concrete proof of such a fleet, the very persistence of the story suggests there were cracks in the net. And as a call back to that chilling morning, we opened with the silence was never complete. Across Europe, some Templars simply vanished. Not all were captured. Some faded into rural villages. Others found refuge in sympathetic courts. In Scotland, in Portugal, in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Templar knights would quietly reappear under different names, or perhaps never reappear at all. The truth is, you can't erase an entire order overnight. Not really. You can burn the uniforms. You can torture confessions, but ideas, oaths, loyalties, those are harder to kill. And so the first chapter of the Purge ended not with the ringing of bells or the crash of swords, but with locked doors, quiet corridors, and the scent of parchment smoldering in a hearth. What began that morning wasn't just a mass arrest. It was the opening act of a trial not bound by walls or years. It was the slow turning of history's blade, held by hands no longer wearing gloves. You can follow the money, or you can follow the fear. But in this story, both trails lead to the same two men, one draped in crimson, the other in royal blue. King Philip IV Fort of France was known as Philip the Fair, though there was little fair about him. Tall, handsome, and cold, he ruled like a man who trusted no one, and with good reason. His kingdom was in debt, deep debt. Wars with England and Flanders had drained the treasury. Even the royal mint had been debased, its coinage altered to stretch what little silver remained. Merchants grumbled. Nobles grew restless. And the people they noticed their bread cost more while their taxes rose like cathedral walls. Philip had already squeezed the Jews, then expelled them. He did the same to the Lombards' Italian bankers who'd lent too much and asked for too much back. And still the crown bled coin. So his eyes turned inevitably to the Templars. The Knights Templar weren't just warriors or monks. By 1300 they had become Europe's most discreet bankers. They held lands across Christendom from Portugal to Hungary. They loaned to nobles guarded pilgrims' deposits, and managed a far-flung web of financial operations that few understood and many envied, including kings. And Philip was not only a borrower, he was deeply indebted to the Templars. Some sources suggest he owed them the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of florins, enough to build an army, enough to bankrupt a throne, enough to destroy a friendship. Now imagine standing in Philip's court, the velvet tapestries, the weight of incense in the air, the looks between advisors who already know what's coming. Philip didn't just want the Templars gone. He needed it, but he couldn't act alone. Not against an order sanctioned directly by the Pope. Enter Clement V, newly elected, diplomatically cautious and living not in Rome, but in Avignon, far from the papal seat of power. Some say Clement was a puppet, others say he was just a pragmatist trying not to be trampled. Either way, he was deeply entangled in Philip's influence, and perhaps in Philip's pocket. Here lies a well-documented fact. Clement V did not initiate the charges against the Templars. He was in fact caught off guard by Philip's arrests. But once the wave began, Clement didn't stop it. Instead, he legitimized it. In 1307, he issued the papal bull Pastorales Preeminent Antennae instructing monarchs across Europe to detain Templars and seize their assets. The Vatican, like Philip, had its reasons. The Holy Land had been lost. The Crusader dream was in ruins. The Templars no longer had a battlefield. Their purpose, at least officially, had become unclear. To some within the Church, they had outlived their usefulness. To others, they were a rising threat, independent, organized, rich, and answerable only to the Pope. Still, Clement hesitated. He called for inquests. He asked for evidence, but by then the machinery was moving too fast. Confessions were pouring in under torture. Property was being catalogued and redistributed, and Philip, ever the tactician, ensured public sentiment stayed on his side. He presented the Templars not as fallen knights, but as secret heretics. Devils in male corruption in the house of God. This brings us to an obscure and unsettling detail, one found in a letter between royal advisors. In it, one of Philip's men openly discusses the political advantage of painting the Templars as guilty before any formal trial could begin. Public perception, it seemed, was just another battlefield. The Templars, of course, denied the charges repeatedly, but under torture, many confessed only to recant once the pain stopped. Their words became twisted echoes, tools for kings and clerics alike. A confession here, a denial there, enough smoke to justify the fire, and then came the bribes, the deals, the whispered bargains behind cathedral walls. Some knights were released after cooperating, others were silenced permanently. And while all this unfolded, Clement issued more bulls, some vague, some contradictory. The Pope, trying to steer the storm, often looked like he was drowning in it. This leads to one of the great open questions of the Templar trials. Was Clement complicit, or just cornered? Did he believe the charges, or did he simply fear the consequences of opposing the most powerful monarch in Europe? The Church had much to lose. Its unity was fragile. Its authority questioned. If Clement had exonerated the Templars outright, it might have triggered a rift, not just with France, but with other kingdoms watching nervously. The safer route, it seems, was ambiguity, delay, and eventually dissolution. But look closer. Return to the documents sealed in Avenue. Some were stamped, some were never sent. There are records of letters drafted and then shelved, prepared and then retracted. The archive tells a quieter story than the chronicles, one of doubt, of indecision, and perhaps of guilt. Let's circle back. You remember that morning, October 13th, the speed of the arrests, the precision of the plan that didn't come from panic. It came from strategy, and it was backed, however reluctantly, by the only man who could make it legitimate, the Pope. The irony is almost theatrical. The Templars had fought for God, bled for Christendom, and yet in the end they were undone by the very institutions they had served. Crown and cross, king and pope, a royal debt, and a papal silence. You can't burn that into the ground. You descend into the darkness slowly, one creaking step at a time. The air grows heavier. The stone walls dampen sound. And soon the only noise left is your own breath echoing faintly in the vaulted chamber below. This is where the confessions came from. Not from faith, not from guilt, from this. You're in a medieval prison now, the kind built beneath castles and behind chapels. Iron rings line the walls. A wooden bench sits angled beneath a system of ropes and pulleys. The torchlight flickers against a rusted grate in the floor. In these rooms, the truth was less important than the script, and the men of the cloth, some of them anyway, had become stage directors of pain. It's no secret that torture was central to the Templar trials. It's one of the few facts that no chronicler could dress up or deny, and it began almost immediately after the arrests. King Philip Ivder's men needed confessions not just as proof, but as validation. Public opinion was a fragile thing. You couldn't simply claim a holy order had turned to heresy and expect belief to follow. You needed voices, witnesses, words from the mouths of the accused. And so the screws were tightened quite literally. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, was among the first to face interrogation alongside other senior leaders. He was transported to the infamous Temple prison in Paris. The irony of the name wasn't lost on anyone. Once a stronghold of the Templars, it now became the stage for their undoing. Under pressure, physical, psychological, spiritual, many knights confessed. Some admitted to spitting on the cross, others to denying Christ. A few even spoke of worshipping a mysterious head. But the details were strange, inconsistent, often fantastical, and nearly always followed by recantation. One obscure testimony comes from a knight named Jean d'Aligny. His confession changed so many times under repeated torture sessions that the inquisitors themselves began to contradict each other. One scribe recorded that he had seen a head like that of a cat, while another described it as a woman's face crowned with silver. Neither could agree on where it had been kept or whether it spoke. But by then the details hardly mattered. What mattered was the appearance of guilt. The Pope himself was disturbed by what he heard. Not just the content, but the methods. In 1308, Clement V ordered a pause to the Inquisitions and requested that Templars be treated with greater fairness. He asked for church-led investigations rather than purely royal ones. But the damage was done. The first wave of torture had already flooded the narrative. Among the cruelest devices used was the strappado, a technique as simple as it was devastating. A prisoner's hands were tied behind his back and then suspended by a rope from the ceiling, pulling the shoulders out of their sockets. It left no visible wounds, which made it legally convenient. But the pain was excruciating, and it broke many men who had once withstood far worse on the battlefield. You wonder what they thought in those final moments of silence before the ropes went taut. Did they pray? Did they curse the crown? Or did they still believe the church would come to their rescue? There was a dark efficiency to the system. If you confessed, you might live. If you didn't, the questioning would continue. If you recanted later, you'd be called a relapsed heretic and face the fire. It wasn't justice. It was arithmetic. And here's the scholarly question that still simmers beneath the surface. How much of what we know about Templar heresy comes from truth, and how much from agony? Is there any validity to the stranger accusations like the idol Baphomet when they only surfaced after men had been broken? Some historians argue that Philip's men planted the imagery in advance, creating a set of expected answers. Others believe there may have been internal rites misunderstood or deliberately distorted by outside eyes. A symbolic gesture becomes a scandal. A whispered phrase becomes evidence of blasphemy. And then there's the case of Geoffroy de Gonneville, a respected knight. He initially resisted confession, even under torture. But later, when he recanted what he'd been forced to admit, he was condemned anyway. Burned alive, not for heresy, but for daring to contradict the narrative. You remember earlier the eerie precision of the arrests, the sealed letters, the synchronized dawn raids. That same choreography extended into the chambers of pain. Testimonies were collected and copied. Some were circulated in courts and churches. Others were destroyed or redacted, because not all confessions were helpful. Some Templars refused to implicate others. Some described their initiation ceremonies in plain, unimpressive terms. No demons, no idols, just vows and prayers and the kiss of peace. Those records tended to vanish or were deemed insufficient. Let's tie this to what came before. Philip had motive. Clement had hesitation. Now with pain as a tool, Philip had evidence or something close enough to pass for it. And Clement, trapped by public opinion and political alliances, could only attempt to shape the aftermath. But even in that darkness, there were glimmers of resistance. Some knights chose silence. Some endured never confessing. Others left behind writings hidden, obscure, encrypted, like ghostly fingerprints, as if to say we were here. And it wasn't like they told you. The Templar trials weren't about uncovering the truth. They were about producing one, a version that served the crown, that fed the fire. And beneath it all, the quiet question remains. If you squeeze history hard enough, what leaks out, truth or smoke? Now the road turns south away from the dungeons and into a different kind of shadow. The kind ink leaves behind when it vanishes for centuries. You walk beside the Vienne River, the breeze cooler here, and ahead rises Chinon Castle. Not a battlefield fortress, but a place of stone corridors, hidden loves, and quiet conversations far from Paris. The year is 1308, and something strange is about to happen. Something that would remain buried for nearly 700 years. Shernon was a turning point. Not in the sense of spectacle. There were no PS here, no crowds with torches, but within its ancient walls, a secret absolution was whispered into parchment. A parchment that would vanish unnoticed into the Vatican archives, only to be rediscovered in 2001. It's called the Shernon Parchment, and it may be the single most inconvenient piece of evidence in the entire Templar saga. To understand its significance, step into that stone chamber again. The Pope, under pressure from all sides, sends his emissaries to question the highest-ranking Templars still alive. Jacques de Molay-Odis and 2 others. These aren't broken men in chains anymore. Here they're afforded dignity, time, and even confession without torture. And what they admit is curious. Yes, they had denied Christ under pressure during initiation rituals, but they had done so only symbolically. Yes, there were strange ceremonies, but not blasphemous ones, not as the king had claimed. They begged forgiveness, and the emissaries on behalf of the Pope grant it. This is the well-documented historical fact. In 1308, the Church quietly absolved the Templar leadership. The Shernon Parchment recorded it. The Pope knew, and yet the suppression continued. You might wonder if Clement V had absolved them. Why did the trials roll forward? Why were the Templars still excommunicated? Their property seized, their leaders burned. The answer lies not in faith, but in fear. Clement feared what would happen if he opposed Philip IV. France was too powerful. The accusations too deeply embedded in the public imagination. So the absolution was shelved, the parchment stored, forgotten. It remained hidden in the Vatican's secret archives until a researcher stumbled upon it centuries later, misfiled under the wrong reference code. That's the obscure detail. The Church had already cleared the Templars and chose to do nothing about it. This raises a question that scholars still debate today. Was Clement trying to preserve the Church's unity by sacrificing justice? Or was the absolution itself a performance offering temporary comfort to dying men while allowing the machinery of eraser to grind forward? And consider this. While Clement was publicly sanctioning inquiries into Templar heresy privately, he was acknowledging that the worst charges had no basis. That the order, though flawed, was not demonic, that the accusations of idol worship, of Baphomet, of obscene rituals, were exaggerations, distortions, or outright lies. Recall from earlier the torture chambers and the inconsistent confessions, the strappado and the symbolic gestures twisted into proof. Shernon was the mirror image of that cruelty, an attempt to make peace quietly after the public damage had been done. But no proclamation followed. No edict of innocence was read from cathedral steps. Instead, the Templar leaders were left to rot in their cells, their absolution sealed away with wax and silence. This moment shone as the fracture line. Before it, the Templars still had hope. After it, that hope became a whisper only the walls could hear. And here's something else. Dale and his men weren't told their absolution would be hidden. As far as we can tell, they believed the Church had forgiven them publicly, that their suffering had not been in vain. It makes their eventual fate, execution by fire without further trial, all the more cruel. They died believing one version of history, while another was being carefully filed away. You're standing in Shernon now, centuries later. The parchment has been translated. The ink is faint, but the words are legible. They tell a different story from the one the world has repeated for generations. Not of heretics, but of broken men seeking forgiveness. Not of devil worship, but of symbolic gestures misunderstood or manipulated. And yet somehow it changed nothing, because the narrative had moved on. Philip had the confessions he wanted. The property was being seized. The trial, already drifting toward its climax, could not be reversed. The Shernon Parchment was a candle lit too late, its light swallowed by the storm. Even now the document raises uncomfortable truths. Why was it hidden? Who chose to misfile it? Was it incompetence or something more deliberate? And what would have happened if it had been made public? Would the order have been spared? Or had the execution already become inevitable, the machinery of power too vast to halt? It's a call back to Section 3, where the politics between Pope and King left Clement paralyzed. Shernon reveals that paralysis in its purest form, a man who knew the truth and chose silence anyway. And in that silence, the firewood was stacked. The ropes tied, the stage set. You walk away from Shernon now, but the echoes follow you. Not screams, not chants, just a quiet shuffling of parchment, a seal pressed into wax, and the kind of absolution that arrives far too late. The door cracks open again, not to a prison cell this time, but to a darker corridor, the kind lit only by rumor and the fevered imagination of frightened men. You're no longer in the realm of quartz and parchment. You've crossed into something more slippery. Here symbols matter more than swords. Shadows whisper louder than facts. And at the center of it all stands a name that still unsettles Baphomet. Few words in the history of the Templar trials carry as much baggage. Even fewer are as persistently misunderstood. The name first appears in the trial records from the early confessions murmured by Templar prisoners who under duress speak of a mysterious head or idol called Baphomet. But what was it? And more importantly, was it ever real? Let's begin with the historical fact. The term Baphomet first emerges in the Latin records of the Inquisitions. It wasn't widely known before that. Several knights, when interrogated, spoke of a head. Some claimed it had a beard. Others said it was covered in silver. A few even described it as having 3 faces. But almost none of them could agree on what it symbolized. One said it was an object of veneration. Another claimed it had magical powers. Most likely they were grasping for words between screams. Modern scholars generally believe the name Baphomet may have been a corruption of Muhammad or Muhammad, a slanderous accusation common in medieval Europe, where enemies of the Church were often conflated with Islamic heresy. Others argue it was a misheard phrase or a garbled rendering of a foreign word misunderstood by French-speaking interrogators. But at the time, none of that mattered. The mere mention of an unknown deity was enough to ignite panic. And it wasn't just Baphomet. The Templars were accused of other strange rites, denying Christ during initiations, spitting on crucifixes, exchanging secret kisses in darkened rooms, sometimes on the base of the spine. Yes, really. This last detail earned the charge of the so-called devil's kiss. A claim so lurid it reads less like testimony and more like ecclesiastical fanfiction. But again, the question lingers, were these practices real or imagined? Here's an obscure detail buried in one of the trial transcripts. A Templar initiate, when asked about the infamous kiss, responded with confusion. He admitted to being kissed on the mouth by his superior as a symbol of peace and unity, but nothing more. There was no eroticism, no perversion, just ritual brotherhood. But when the inquisitors asked again, this time more sternly, his answer changed. The kisses moved downward, the meaning darker. Under torture, truth bends like hot metal. This brings us to the scholarly debate that still smolders. Quietly, did the Templars actually practice esoteric rites that were later misinterpreted, or were they entirely fabricated by their enemies? Some researchers believe the order's initiations were intentionally secretive and symbolic, echoing older Gnostic or Eastern Christian rites brought back from the Holy Land. Others insist the whole affair was a fabrication designed to justify the destruction of a wealthy, independent power. The charges were so over the top, so inconsistent, that even contemporaries doubted their validity. And yet they stuck. And why? Because symbols are sticky, especially when they scare you. The image of a bearded idol, the idea of hidden knowledge, the threat of perversion masquerading as piety. These weren't just accusations. They were nightmares projected onto robes and swords. And when repeated enough times, even the most absurd image, say a silver head speaking prophecy, begins to feel possible. Let's not forget what came before. Back in Chinon, we saw that the Pope himself privately absolved the Templar leaders, that the worst accusations, including idol worship, were judged and proven. And yet, that quiet truth was swallowed by louder lies. Baphomet survived the trials not because it was real, but because it was useful. Over time, the legend evolved. During the Enlightenment, it became a symbol of hidden wisdom. In the 19th century, occultists like Eliphas Levi reinvented Baphomet as a goat-headed figure, arms outstretched, one pointing to heaven and the other to earth, a symbol of duality, balance, arcane truth. But that figure, the one you might picture now, has no connection to the medieval trials. It's an artistic invention, a retroactive myth. Still, the name lingers as if truth didn't matter, as if the accusation itself carried its own sacred weight. One final note, the heads. During the raids on Templar properties, no physical idol matching the trial descriptions was ever found. No silver face, no speaking relic, nothing with horns or hidden inscriptions, just words, just fear. And the quiet knowledge that something powerful had to be destroyed. So what then was Baphomet? A code, a metaphor, a misunderstanding, a political weapon? All of these or none. You walk out of that chamber now trailing the scent of old incense and sweat. The shadows still cling to your cloak, and you understand more than before that symbols don't need to be real to have power. They just need to be believed. Or feared. And for the Knights Templar, it wasn't swords or armies that doomed them. It was a name no one could explain, and everyone was afraid to ignore. You find yourself in a candle-lit chamber now, the kind that smells faintly of old beeswax and leather-bound secrets. There's a scroll on the table, a wax seal, a ring with a red cross pressed into its face. The room is still, but somewhere in the margins of these shadows, something stirs, whispers, not of swords, but of symbols. This is the Templars' quieter battleground. Not fields or fortresses, but code, cipher, and the maddening ambiguity of hidden meaning. You see, it wasn't just the Templars' wealth or their whispered heresies that stirred suspicion. It was the sense that they knew something others didn't. That behind the austere white mantles and solemn vows, the order had secrets. Not just political ones, but ancient esoteric wisdom that had traveled with them from the Holy Land, tucked inside saddlebags, sealed behind stone, and passed by mouth in languages no one else could follow. And perhaps the most unnerving part, they didn't deny it. Not really. Here is your historical fact. The Knights Templar were known to employ secret signs, gestures, and internal protocols that set them apart from other orders. They had their own modes of identification. Initiation rites were conducted in private, even from lower-ranked members. They communicated across continents using codes embedded in seemingly ordinary correspondence. This wasn't unusual for a military religious order operating across borders. But in a time when secrecy often equaled suspicion, it made people nervous. And that's where imagination did what it always does. It filled in the gaps. An obscure and controversial interpretation comes from a set of carved stones found at former Templar sites in Languedoc and Aragon. They bear what appear to be strange markings, interlocking crosses, half-finished stars, inverted loops, none of which align perfectly with Christian iconography. Some believe these were part of a symbolic code, perhaps tied to ancient numerologies or Eastern mysticism. Others argue they were just stonemasons' marks, ordinary, functional misread. But of course, in the aftermath of the trials, nothing stayed ordinary for long. The idea took hold that the Templars were guardians of hidden knowledge, that beneath their rigid discipline lay a vault of arcane insight, astronomy, sacred geometry, even Gnostic scripture, that they had uncovered something in Jerusalem, something they couldn't or wouldn't share. You may recall the earlier charges, the head of Baphomet, the secret kisses, the alleged idol. Now think of those not as isolated accusations, but as pieces in a larger puzzle. Together they began to form an image not just of heresy, but of an underground world, a secret priesthood, a rival current within Christianity itself. And that image frightened people more than the order's power ever did. This led to one of the more enduring scholarly debates. Were the Templars simply victims of their own mystique? Or did they deliberately cultivate it? Were they hiding truths, religious, political, esoteric, that threatened church orthodoxy, or had their silence been filled with paranoia and myth? Take, for example, the persistent rumor that the Templars possessed documents from the Temple of Solomon, ancient scrolls, secret histories, even relics tied to the earliest days of Christianity. None of these were found, of course, but that didn't stop the stories. If anything, the absence of evidence only deepened the belief that something had been concealed. We'll call back to Section 6 where we explored the name Baphomet and the ambiguity of symbols. In that same fog, we now find gestures, hand signs used in initiation phrases spoken in ritual, the peculiar way one knight might place his hand on another's shoulder. Were these remnants of deeper teachings, or simply the guarded customs of a closed brotherhood? The Church wanted certainty. The Crown wanted clarity. But the Templars offered neither. And that lack of transparency combined with their reach and wealth was dangerous. Let's not forget the visual language either. The red cross on white. The twin knights on a single horse. Poverty and brotherhood, yes, but also duality. Symbols that hinted at meanings beyond the surface. And for those inclined to suspicion, that was enough. Even now, modern researchers comb through surviving Templar buildings and manuscripts, searching for signs of hidden writing, acrostics and Latin prayers, numeric patterns in floor tiles, star maps disguised as decorative motifs. Most of it leads nowhere, but some makes you pause. A carved 8-pointed star beneath a chapel in Tamar, Portugal. A fresco in Italy showing a knight reaching into a chest filled not with gold but scrolls. Coincidences maybe, or maybe remnants of something carefully veiled. And then centuries later, these mysteries would be reborn through groups claiming Templar descent or inspiration. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, secret societies dressed in robes and echoes. Many drew from Templar symbolism, whether authentically or not. The myth grew longer legs than the facts ever could. Which brings us to a quiet realization. Maybe that was always the point. To preserve the ambiguity, to cloak whatever truth remained in enough ritual code and half-spoken memory that it could survive not in plain sight, but just beneath it. So you sit now in the half-light parchment and hand symbols swirling at the edge of understanding. And the deeper question becomes clear. Not what the Templars hid, but why we're still looking, still decoding, still dreaming that some deeper truth lies just behind the next ciphered phrase. And maybe, just maybe, it does. You're walking through a vault now, or at least the memory of one. The air is cool and dry, like a place where secrets are stored, not shouted. Stone walls press in from all sides. A faint scent of aged wood and cold iron lingers. You can almost hear the clang of a lock turning, the echo of footsteps retreating down a corridor long since sealed. But no matter how far you go, the treasure is never quite there. Only the story remains. The Knights Templar were rich. That much is undisputed. By the time of their downfall in the early 14th century, they held thousands of properties across Europe and the Holy Land: farms, mills, vineyards, churches, and entire towns. They collected taxes, issued loans, and operated one of the most sophisticated financial networks in medieval Europe. Pilgrims trusted them to guard their wealth. Kings trusted them to move it. The church trusted them until it didn't. So when the hammer fell in 1307, everyone expected to find mountains of treasure, gold, silver, precious relics. But when Philip IV's agents stormed Templar properties across France, what they found was very little. Some furniture, livestock, a few ledgers, but the chests of bullion, the fabled hoards, vanished. And this is where the mystery deepens. The well-established fact. In the days leading up to the mass arrest on October 13th, the Paris Temple, the order's central treasury, was unusually active. According to royal records, several carts were seen leaving the compound guarded and unregistered, their destination unknown, their contents never listed. Some speculate it was merely bookkeeping, repositioning resources, moving assets for routine reasons. But the timing feels wrong, too convenient. It's as if someone knew what was coming. That's the open question that still haunts historians. Did the Templars hide their wealth in anticipation of their arrest? And if so, where did it go? There are plenty of theories, of course. Some suggest the treasure was smuggled to Scotland, where sympathetic lords kept it hidden. Others believe it was spirited away to Portugal, where the Templar order morphed into the Order of Christ, quietly continuing under a new name. A few fringe voices claim it ended up in Switzerland, even tying its disappearance to the rise of secretive banking practices centuries later. And then there's the truly esoteric theory. The treasure wasn't gold at all, but knowledge, scrolls, relics, something too sacred or too dangerous to leave in plain sight. An obscure but compelling detail can be found in a ship's manifest from La Rochelle, a major Templar port. Shortly after the arrests, a small fleet was reported leaving the harbor. No names, no destinations. Just a notation in maritime records that the vessels departed under cover of night. The fleet was never seen again. Could it have carried the missing treasure? And what exactly was that treasure? Because here's the thing. For an order as wealthy as the Templars, their accounting was surprisingly sparse. Some historians argue that wealth was tied up in property, not coins. But even then, the confiscated lands didn't explain the rumored scale of their fortune. Something didn't add up. This leads us back to earlier chapters, to the coded rituals, the strange symbols, the whispers of hidden knowledge. Could the treasure have been something more abstract? A relic unearthed beneath Jerusalem. A document capable of undermining church doctrine. Or maybe, just maybe, something symbolic, a myth forged by hope and fear in equal measure. Consider the tale of the Ark of the Covenant. Some believe the Templars discovered it during their early years in the Holy Land and spirited it away. Others claim they found scrolls containing the bloodline of Christ. Yes, that theory, and built their secret rituals around protecting that truth. Most scholars dismiss these ideas, but still they persist because the absence of treasure is its own kind of invitation. It dares us to imagine. And there's a call back waiting here from Chinon Castle, where absolution was whispered and sealed away. From Baphomet, whose head was never found. From the coded language whose meaning remains just out of reach. The missing treasure ties them all together. A common thread of what might have been. If only we could find it. Even King Philip, greedy as he was, couldn't quite pin it down. His men searched high and low, sifting through ledgers, interrogating priests, even tearing up floorboards. But they never found the motherlode, which might explain why the charges grew stranger as the trial dragged on. When you can't find the gold, you invent the demons. And so the legend grew, a treasure so vast and sacred it had to be hidden forever. Some believe it still exists, buried beneath Rosslyn Chapel or sealed inside a mountain vault in the Pyrenees. Others say it was scattered in pieces, protected by descendants of the order who still walk among us, cloaked not in armor but anonymity. But perhaps the real treasure was this: a story, a void into which we can pour our hopes, our suspicions, our fantasies, something to search for, something to wonder about. And in that way, the Templars achieved a kind of immortality that no coin could buy. You leave the vault now empty-handed, but not empty-hearted. Because some treasures aren't meant to be found, only followed. The fire glows ahead, flickering against the evening sky like a second cruel sun. It's March 18th, 1314, and you've reached the end of a road few dared imagine. The square by the sun in Paris is crowded but silent. People speak in whispers. Some avert their eyes. Others stare frozen, as if watching the final page of a sacred book being torn away. On a raised platform of timber, two figures stand bound. One of them wears the worn dignity of a man who has lost everything but refuses to kneel. Jacques de Molay, the last Grandmaster of the Knights Templar. There is no trial today, no jury, just firewood and silence broken only by the crack of the torch as it's thrust into the kindling. The well-established fact is this. After nearly 7 years in prison, Jacques de Molay was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. But when the sentence was read aloud, something unexpected happened. De Molay stood up and withdrew his confession right there in public. Before the crowd and the flames, he declared that he and his fellow Templars were innocent of the heresies laid against them, that the order was pure, that the confessions were lies wrung from broken bodies. And that moment, those few defiant words changed everything, because now he was no longer a heretic. He was a threat. The king's agents didn't hesitate. That very evening, with no appeal, no delay, he was marched to the stake. Alongside him stood Geoffroy Desire, preceptor of Normandy. Both had been interrogated. Both had confessed. And now both chose to burn rather than live with a lie. As the flames rose, witnesses claimed de Molay called upon King Philip and Pope Clement to join him before the judgment seat of God within the year. And in a twist that has fueled centuries of speculation, both men did in fact die within that year. Clement just a month later, Philip by the year's end. Coincidence? Divine justice? Or simply the kind of historical poetry that hindsight loves to write? But it's the obscure details that make the scene shimmer strangely. Some reports say de Molay remained silent. Others say he cried out for vengeance. Still others describe a serenity in his face as the fire engulfed him. The contradictions only deepen the mystery, because with his death something shifted. The Templars were gone, but their story was only beginning. There's an obscure letter buried in the archives of the Vatican, hinting that not all within the Church agreed with the execution. One cardinal unnamed reportedly wrote that the burning of de Molay was not justice, but theater, a performance for the crown. And if you remember the sheen on parchment where the Pope had quietly absolved the Templars 6 years earlier, you'll understand just how tragic that performance truly was. The absolved Grandmaster burned anyway. Called back too to the treasure that vanished, to the symbols left unspoken, to the coded rituals and the rumors of Baphomet. All of it seemed to collapse here in smoke and ash. The questions still burned, but the man at their center was silenced. The scholarly debate that endures centers not only on what de Molay said, but why it mattered. Was it a calculated move hoping to preserve honor in death? Was it a final rejection of lies long endured? Or was it simply the last breath of a man who had lost everything but faith? You may wonder why they didn't simply let him fade away in prison. Why risk the spectacle? Because silence can be powerful, but so can a scream. And de Molay's final act turned the fire from a punishment into a beacon. The Church had hoped to control the narrative. The Crown had hoped to close the book. But history had other plans. With one outcry, the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay lit a torch that would be carried into legend. And legend, as we've seen, is far harder to extinguish than flame. In the centuries that followed, secret societies would invoke de Molay's name. Writers and revolutionaries would call him a symbol of resistance. His death would become not the end of a chapter, but the prologue to 100 whispered tales. Even now, there are Templar-inspired organizations that mark March 18th with solemn ceremonies. Not because they know exactly what happened, but because something about it still feels unfinished. And perhaps that's what lingers, not just the smoke, not just the curse, but the weight of injustice wrapped in holy robes. You step away from the scaffold now. The embers are cooling. The crowd disperses. Somewhere nearby, the sun continues to flow, quiet, unbothered. But behind you, in that pile of ash, something sacred and unsettled remains. Because you've seen men die for power and others for pride. But here was a man who chose fire over falsehood, and in doing so became something the church and crown never expected, a ghost they couldn't banish. The halls of Avignon are hushed now. You walk them softly, your footsteps muffled by centuries of whispers trapped in stone. The air carries a faint chill, not from the season, but from the knowledge that this place, this city of exiled popes and political shadows, once held within it the echo chamber of the Templars' fate. And though the flames of Paris had claimed Jacques de Molay here in Avignon, the machinery that destroyed him kept turning quieter perhaps, but no less deliberate. This was not Rome, not the sacred heart of the church. Avignon by the early 1300s had become the papal seat, a compromise to French influence, and a symbol of power that had learned how to whisper rather than roar. It's here that Pope Clement V issued the final blows against the Templar order through bulls and decrees shaped behind closed doors and polished with caution. Here is your well-established historical fact: in 1312, under pressure from King Philip IV, for Clement formally dissolved the Knights Templar through the Bulwarks in Excelso. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't even a trial outcome. The Pope stated plainly that the order was not condemned by definitive judgment, but abolished by apostolic ordinance. A soft-edged phrasing, slippery, ambiguous, as though the pen had been dipped in water rather than ink. This linguistic sleight of hand is important because despite years of interrogation, torture, and trial, the Church had never conclusively proven the Templars guilty of heresy. And yet they were dissolved anyway. Why? Because the alternative, clearing them, would have shattered the fragile alliance between crown and cross. So Clement chose silence, and in doing so condemned the order without ever saying the word guilty. Now let's peer into one of the more obscure corners of the archives. A letter and sign tucked within the correspondence between Avignon and various inquisitors in France. In it, a cleric expresses unease about the contradictions in testimony, how some confessions were gained under torture, others retracted, many contradictory. The letter asks whether it would not be more prudent to proceed no further. It's a faint voice of doubt quickly buried, never followed up. But it's there, a flicker of conscience inside the machinery. And then there is the shin on parchment, a document long hidden in the Vatican secret archives and only rediscovered in 2001. We've spoken of it before, but here in Avignon, its context grows sharper. The parchment contains the record of a private absolution granted to the highest Templar leaders, including de Molay, in 1308. They had confessed under pressure, yes, but showed repentance. The Pope through his cardinals forgave them. They were not condemned, not excommunicated. They were in a word restored. So why then were they burned? That's the question that still ripples through the halls of Avignon. And it brings us to a core scholarly debate. Did Pope Clement truly believe the Templars were guilty? Or was he simply navigating the tides of political necessity? Was he coerced by Philip the Vulper? Was he complicit? Or was he perhaps just trying to limit damage to preserve the Church's image while avoiding outright confrontation? You may remember the fleet that vanished from La Rochelle, the treasure that slipped through the king's fingers, the codes and symbols that never gave up their secrets. Now picture Clement isolated in Avignon holding 1,000 threads and watching each unravel in a different direction. The order was broken, but the truth remained entangled. And maybe that's what disturbed him most. Because here's a detail that tends to go unnoticed. Clement's health declined rapidly after the order's dissolution. He died less than a year after de Molay's execution, his final months shadowed by migraines and insomnia. Some claimed it was divine punishment, others poetic irony. But perhaps it was just the weight of too many sealed letters, too many quiet choices made behind doors no one else could open. One wonders what he thought of de Molay's final words, whether they reached him, whether in the flickering silence of his papal quarters he whispered back. Avignon became a city of echoes, papal bulls, sealed scrolls, inked decisions, all flowing out from its corridors like smoke from a slow fire. But the contradictions lingered. Why exonerate a man in private, then let him burn in public? Why destroy an order if you cannot prove its guilt? And the most haunting echo of all, what truth was left out of the official records, because even now gaps remain, pages missing from ledgers, testimonies redacted, whole trunks of documents vanished from the papal archives. Some say it was war or decay. Others believe it was deliberate, that certain truths were just too dangerous to leave lying around. You pass beneath a stone arch, now sunlight dappling the ancient flagstones. There's no one here. Not really. Just the silence of paperwork once weighted with power. But that silence, it says something. It says that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by those who fear what truth might cost. And as you step back into the open air, the quiet lingers, not because no one spoke, but because too many did, and none of them said the same thing. The door cracks open behind you, not to a chapel or a courtroom, but to a coastal path bathed in mist. The sea murmurs below, gentle waves gnawing at stone. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cries, once then falls silent. You can almost see it. A hooded figure slipping into a small boat. A coiled rope tossed aboard, a last glance over the shoulder. Then gone out into the fog. The Templars were meant to vanish. Erased. Their leaders burned. Their assets seized, their legacy scattered. But for all the fire and parchment, the final chapter refused to end. Because while some knights were arrested and tried, others somehow weren't. They disappeared. Not into myth just yet, but into silence. And silence, as we've seen, can be a kind of survival. Let's begin with the solid ground of fact. Not all Templars across Europe were captured in the mass arrests of 1307. In places like Germany, Cyprus, and parts of England, the persecution was uneven and often resisted by local lords. In Scotland, the papal bull against the Templars went largely unenforced, perhaps because Scotland was excommunicated at the time and had little interest in the Pope's orders. Convenient if you were a knight looking for refuge. An obscure but tantalizing thread winds through Aragon and Catalonia, where Templar strongholds held out longer than expected. In some towns, arrests were delayed. In others, local clergy simply refused to believe the charges. And in the meantime, documents, gold, and most importantly, people slipped away. La Rochelle, you've heard the name before, the Templar port. According to some 14th century sources, a fleet vanished from there in the days after the arrests began. It was never seen again. The records stopped cold. No logs, no sightings, just absence. Some believe this fleet carried treasure. But others suspect it carried something even more valuable, the remaining leadership of the order. Perhaps even pre-warned by sympathetic insiders, they may have set sail for places where papal influence was thin and political pressure weaker. One enduring theory places their destination as Scotland. Another points to Portugal, where the Order of Christ rose shortly afterward, staffed largely by former Templars under a new name. And here comes a controversial interpretation, one wrapped in maritime legend and the thin veil between history and romance. Some claim that ships from the Templar fleet made it as far as the New World. Long before Columbus, long before crafters had even finished sketching the edges of the known world, there are no credible maps to prove it. No surviving logs, just fragments, hints. Masonic murals, a tower in Newport, Rhode Island, whose architecture some say resembles Templar design. Most historians dismiss it, and yet the idea persists. A more grounded possibility is that many Templars simply folded back into society. Some became monks. Others joined military orders that hadn't yet been outlawed. A few may have lived as farmers under assumed names. The order had trained thousands of men in discipline, logistics, engineering, and combat. Those skills didn't vanish with the brand. They just moved. And in Portugal, the transition was practically seamless. King Denis of Portugal negotiated with the Pope to transfer the Templar assets into a new order, the Order of Christ. It used the same infrastructure, the same symbols with minor modifications, and many of the same knights. It was effectively the Templars in all but name. And through this order, Portugal would later launch its golden age of exploration. That's a curious twist, isn't it? That the suppressed might become the navigators of a new world. Let's call back briefly to the coded language we explored earlier. The signs, the rituals, the symbolic gestures. If a handful of Templars did survive, they would have needed those tools more than ever. Secret handshakes weren't just dramatic flair. They were a way to identify friend from foe when your very identity was outlawed. So where did they all go? That's the open question. Did they regroup, waiting for vindication? Or did they melt into the broader world their story carried in whispers and shadow? Was there a grand plan for resurgence? Or did the order fade with dignity, leaving only embers behind? What complicates the search is the mythology that ballooned in later centuries. Freemasonry, as we'll explore, soon absorbed many Templar symbols and themes. But whether that represents true lineage or romantic inheritance is debated fiercely. What we do know is this. The world wanted the Templars to survive, needed them to. There's something irresistible about the idea of an outlaw brotherhood living on in secret, keepers of wisdom, protectors of treasure, silent sentinels watching from the margins. And yet, it's possible the real survival wasn't about ships or gold. It was about memory, about the stories whispered in taverns, the emblems carved into stone, the strange rites that persisted in places far from Avignon's gaze. In the end, survival may not require escape. It may simply require a story too enduring to erase. So now you're standing at the water's edge. The boat is gone. The mist is closing in. Behind you, history claims closure. But ahead beyond the fog, something else waits. A possibility. A path that bends quietly into legend. The candlelight flickers against stone once more, but the carvings have changed. The cross is gone. In its place, a compass, a square, a stylized eye gazing outward from a triangle. You've stepped forward in time now, several centuries from the fires of Paris. Yet somehow the air feels familiar, charged with the same silence, the same secrets. The Freemasons emerged into the public eye in the 17th and 18th centuries, claiming roots in medieval stonemason guilds. Lodges sprang up across Europe, blending ritual, morality, architecture, and philosophy into an elaborate symbolic system. They wore aprons, spoke in allegory, and prized the hidden meaning behind the seen world. At first glance, there's no reason to connect them with the Knights Templar. Different time, different goals. But listen a little closer. One well-established historical fact is that Freemasonry, particularly in its speculative form, borrowed heavily from older traditions and mythologies, medieval orders, biblical figures, esoteric philosophies, and among the most persistent symbolic inheritances was the mystique of the Templars. Many Masonic lodges began including the Templar cross in their regalia. Some even adopted names like Knights Templar Commander. By the 18th century, Templar-themed degrees had become common within certain Masonic rites, especially in the York and Scottish rites. Initiates underwent rituals said to mirror those of ancient knighthood. Not real knighthood, mind you, but the idea of it, a revival, or perhaps a reenactment, depending on how seriously one takes the veil. And here's the obscure detail. In 1740, a German book circulated under the title Laverite de Tolier, The Truth of the Templars, claiming that the Freemasons were the legitimate heirs of the suppressed order. It even outlined a supposed line of succession names passed down in secret rituals preserved in code. There's no hard evidence to support this lineage, but the book didn't need evidence. It had allure. And in the shadowy corridors of history, allure is often more enduring than fact. This brings us to one of the most hotly debated scholarly questions. Is there any genuine historical continuity between the medieval Templars and modern Freemasonry? The short answer, probably not. The long answer, maybe, but not in the way we think. There's no documented survival of the Templar hierarchy beyond the early 14th century. No unbroken chain of leadership, no surviving parchment linking Jacques de Molay to a Masonic lodge. But what did survive perhaps more crucially was the idea of the Templars, their symbols, their perceived ideals of loyalty, secrecy, sacrifice, and resistance to corruption. These became part of the free Masonic imagination. And that imagination has power. We can trace a few faint fingerprints, though. Recall Portugal's Order of Christ, where former Templars quietly continued under royal protection. The order played a key role in the age of exploration, influencing maritime navigation and scientific inquiry. Centuries later, several Portuguese Masons would claim spiritual ancestry from this same order. Whether that's fact or fiction is unclear, but the thread was kept alive. Likewise, many early Freemasons were fascinated by the Gothic-style arches, pillars, sacred geometry, echoes of the churches and cathedrals the Templars had once built or funded. Some lodges went so far as to design initiation chambers that mimicked crypts or medieval vaults. Aesthetic mimicry, perhaps, but when paired with ritual language about lost wisdom and ancient brotherhoods, the resemblance starts to feel more than decorative. Now, let's call back. Remember the coded rituals the Templars were accused of, the secret signs and strange words. Imagine those transformed, sanitized, spiritualized into the moral allegories of Freemasonry. Imagine the torch passed not from man to man, but from myth to myth. From whispered accusation to chosen identity. In some modern Masonic rites, the initiate undergo a trial meant to symbolize death and rebirth. In Templar legend, too, there is death by fire and the rebirth of the order in secrecy. The symmetry is elegant, if not exact. It's tempting to say the Freemasons adopted the Templar myth for legitimacy. After all, linking yourself to a fallen, persecuted brotherhood carries drama, gravitas, and built-in mystique. But what if it wasn't just branding? What if it was longing, a desire to preserve something noble from the ashes, even if only in symbol? That brings us to one last theory more poetic than provable. That the Templars did survive not as a group, but as a ghost. Not in stone castles or papal ledgers, but in minds hungry for meaning. In the lodges of Freemasonry, that ghost was given new garments, new oaths, new halls. It no longer needed swords. It needed symbols. Of course, skeptics roll their eyes. They argue that the Templar link was fabricated during the Enlightenment, a way for secret societies to clothe themselves in medieval glamour. And they're probably right, at least in part. But still, the compass glows faintly. The square catches the light, and above them both the all-seeing eye watches, not with malice, but with memory. You leave the lodge now, walking slowly through a hall that might never have seen a knight in armor. But somehow you feel their presence anyway. Not literal, not provable, just echoed. Because sometimes history survives not in bloodlines or documents, but in the symbols we choose to believe. The room is colder than it should be. Not from draft or stone, but from something less visible, a kind of historical hush. You're standing in the Vatican's secret archives, or at least imagining it. Towering shelves loom in perfect rows. Scrolls, ledgers, handwritten decrees. Centuries of history carefully wrapped in leather linen or silence. Somewhere in here, the story of the Templars was supposed to end neatly, conclusively. But you already know that didn't happen. Because where there should be records, there are gaps. Where there should be names, there are redactions. Where there should be justice, there is ambiguity. The well-established historical fact is that the Vatican maintained a vast and meticulous record of the Templar trials, particularly in France. Testimonies were taken, interrogations transcribed, papal bulls issued, and yet when modern scholars gained access to those records, especially after Pope Leo opened parts of the secret archives in the 1880s, they discovered something strange. A pattern of disappearances, not people this time. Pages. Entire volumes relating to the trials are either missing or heavily censored. Margins are darkened. Parchments scratched out with careful precision. In one case, a catalogue from 1628 lists a series of trial documents that no longer exist in the current collection. No explanation, no notation, just gone. That's not to say everything is missing. Much of the raw testimony remains, but the absences feel targeted, as if someone once tried not to erase the story entirely, but to reshape it, to control the narrative by removing the troublesome footnotes, the contradictions, the confessions that were retracted, the bishops who hesitated, the cardinals who disagreed. An obscure but compelling case concerns the Avignon notary Reno de Monlar. His transcripts of certain Templar hearings appear in earlier inventories, but vanish in later ones. His name fades from documents without reason. Some suspect he recorded exonerating testimony, words the Church later preferred to forget. There's also the curious matter of the papal registers. These books, which record the internal workings of the pontifical court, show abrupt gaps in correspondence from the crucial years around 1307-1314. Letters from inquisitors go unanswered. Orders from the Pope seem to vanish mid-dialogue, as if the conversation were edited in hindsight, the way a playwright trims a scene after opening night. And then, of course, the Chinon parchment hidden for nearly 700 years in a file labeled miscellaneous, not filed with the main trial records, not referenced in key summaries. It's as though the absolution it contained, the quiet acknowledgement that the Templars had confessed under duress, had shown repentance, and had been granted forgiveness, was just a little too inconvenient to leave on the main shelf. Let's call back once again to the political stakes of it all. To King Philip the fort's crushing debt. To Clem V's delicate balancing act. To the fire that consumed Jacques de Molay. All of it points toward a story too fragile to let rest on raw documents alone. So instead, the record was curated, not falsified entirely, just blurred like a painting touched up by a later hand softening the harsh edges. And that leads us to the open question. How much of what we know about the Templar downfall is true? And how much is missing because someone wanted it to be? There's a persistent theory that the Vatican, not out of malevolence but institutional instinct, practiced a form of archival correction, not to destroy truth, but to protect orthodoxy. After all, if the Church had wrongly condemned a holy order, absolved them in private, then let them burn anyway. Well, that's not the kind of story one leaves lying around in plain sight. Some whisper about a lost Liber, a rumored ledger detailing financial transactions between the Templars and various European nobles, possibly including Philip IV for himself. No copy has ever been found. Some scholars think it never existed. Others believe it's hidden either in a private vault or destroyed quietly centuries ago. And then there's the Vatican's Index of Forbidden Books. A list, yes, of heretical texts, but also of dangerous histories. Books that question the official narrative, some of which link the Templars to mysticism, secret knowledge, or even a prophetic role in end-times theology. Most of these books were suppressed before they reached wide audiences. Some, like Processa's Contra Templarios, were rediscovered only recently and released with little fanfare, like a whisper in a storm. You might expect outrage or scandal, but more often there's just silence, because silence is the most effective eraser of all. No need to disprove, just delay, redact, ignore. And yet the holes themselves tell a story. Because for every page that vanishes, curiosity grows. For every burned document, a rumor ignites. In a way, the Templar story lives precisely because it was never allowed to close. Every missing piece invites speculation. Every smudge becomes a clue. You move now through a corridor lined with locked drawers, each one labeled in Latin, each one a coffin for facts too volatile to breathe. But somewhere in there perhaps is a parchment that slipped through, a single thread left dangling. And when someone pulls it years from now, or maybe tomorrow, another layer will fall away. Because silence doesn't mean the truth is dead. It just means it's waiting. Now you stand in a chamber without windows. The walls are smooth stone, pale and unmarked, as though time itself hesitated to carve its verdict here. This is not a courtroom, and yet everything about it feels judicial. The heavy quiet, the unseen weight in the air, the sense that something important happened or was supposed to. And maybe that's exactly the point. Because after all the arrests, all the interrogations, all the fire and parchment and smoke, there was never a true verdict. The trial of the Templars concluded in a whisper, not with a declaration of guilt or innocence, but with a kind of bureaucratic shrug. The order was dissolved, yes. The leaders were punished, yes. But were they condemned? Not exactly. Let's begin with the most foundational fact. In 1312, Pope Clement Th issued Vox in Excelso, a bull that dissolved the Knights Templar. But he made it painfully clear that this was not a formal judgment. Instead, it was a pastoral decision based on the public scandal the order's continued existence would provoke. In other words, the Templars were not found guilty. They were found inconvenient. That might seem like splitting hairs, but in legal and spiritual terms, it matters. It left the entire case unfinished, and it also left room for doubt, for speculation, for mythology to sneak in and lay roots. Now, recall the Chinon parchment buried for centuries in the Vatican's shadows. It confirmed that the Templar leadership had confessed under pressure and had been granted absolution. If that document had been publicized in 1312, it might have changed everything. But it wasn't. Instead, it remained hidden, and the story of the Templars hardened into a half-truth. One obscure detail from the Council of Vienne, which convened shortly before the dissolution, illustrates the awkwardness of the whole affair. Multiple bishops voiced concern over the legality of dissolving the order without a final verdict. They questioned the process. Some even proposed that new hearings be held. But those voices were drowned out. Not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. The king wanted closure. The pope needed political survival. So the dissenters fell silent. And what of justice? What of those thousands of knights who served loyally without accusations or scandal? Many were absorbed into other orders. Some received pensions. Others simply faded from history, their names lost in parish ledgers or burial records. They weren't judged because there was no judgment. Their order simply vanished beneath them like a trapdoor pulled mid-sentence. You've walked with these knights through the storm. The arrests on October 13th, the whispered tortures, the coded rituals, the quiet absolution. You followed them across seas into shadows, into the lodges and vaults of imagination. But now we reach the end of the road, and it is paved not with answers, but with questions. Was the trial of the Templars a cover for a financial assassination? Was it a spiritual reckoning for secret practices? Or was it a political chess match played out over parchment and purse? Did they deserve their fate, or were they simply too rich, too proud, too independent to survive in a world where church and crown had begun to blur? One modern historian referred to the Templar trial as the most sophisticated piece of character assassination in medieval Europe. That's one way to put it. Another is to call it a play with no final act. A case file that remains open but unstaffed. Even Jacques de Mol's final words resist clarity. His curse, if it was real, became a convenient echo when both Pope and King died within a year of his execution. But coincidence is not causality, and poetry is not proof. Still, it lingers, doesn't it? Now, let's pull back. Think of the trial not just as an event, but as a mirror. It reflected the fears of the age. Fear of power without oversight of wealth, outside taxation of loyalty that pledged itself to something other than crown or cross. The Templars weren't saints, but they weren't demons either. They were complex, and complexity rarely fares well in eras of absolutes. And that perhaps is the most haunting part of all, because when you examine all the evidence stack, it neatly brush away the soot and scribbles, you're left with a strange emptiness. A case that was heard around the world, but never actually closed. No final verdict, no full truth, just a set of silences shaped to look like justice. And maybe that's why the story never dies, because it's not finished. So you stand in the center of this windowless chamber. No judges, no jury, no gavel, only the ghost of a question. What exactly was on trial? A man, an order, a dream you decide. Or don't. Maybe it's better that way. Because some trials never end. The fire has long since died down. The walls are gone. The towers have crumbled, their banners taken by wind and moss. But in the hush that follows history, one figure remains. Not in armor, not in chains, just a man hooded by time, silhouetted in the smoke of memory, waiting, watching, still on trial. Jacques de Mol's ashes long ago scattered into the senator. But the questions that clung to his life never fully settled. They drifted into the bloodstream of story, seeping quietly into manuscripts. Murals whispered conversations over dusty shelves. And now here you are centuries later still listening. The world has changed since 1314. Kings are thinner on the ground. The church no longer commands armies. Fortresses crumble. Archives' digitized secrets become hashtags. But some stories refuse to be tamed by time. They remain half-open doors, drafts in the stonework flickers in the dark. And the tale of the Templars, of their sudden fall, their enduring myth, and their ambiguous truth is one of them. Because at its core, it's not just about knights or treasure or rituals lost. It's about power, about what people do when they feel threatened, about how fear dresses itself in justice, and how silence can be mistaken for closure. It's also about faith, not only the kind prayed in Latin beneath stained glass, but the quieter kind. Faith in institutions, in evidence, in memory. And how easily that faith is tested when the pages start going missing. Jacques de Mol is gone. So are the cardinals, the kings, the scribes who wrote their justifications in thick ink. But the verdict never came. And so symbolically, the last Templar remains on the stand, his gaze steady, his mouth closed, not pleading, not accusing, just waiting. And in a way, so are we. Because as long as the story survives, the trial continues. A final breath now. The candles flicker one last time. The chamber fades and silence falls not as an ending, but as an echo.